Okay, sounds good.
And, don't even think about time. Just go on. Stop whenever you want, or if you want to take questions. Usually people take questions at the end, but you could also take questions in the middle and then continue. You can do something, whatever you feel like, whatever seems to make sense.
Is there a way of seeing the chat while my screen is
Yeah,
shared?
if you go to the bottom. Oh, if you're sharing your screen, you can't see anything. It
Okay.
takes up your screen. Yeah, no. I mean, I can see it, but I don't. Your screen is just taking up a little part of my window. I don't think there is,
Okay.
which is kind of a defect in this. They should be able to look at both. There may be a way, but I don't know what. Okay, I'm going to let people in, and then I'm going to disable the waiting room if I can. Hi. We'll start in about 4 minutes. Thank you for coming. Whoops. I know people are still registering for this event, so. Last minute. Okay. 3 minutes. So are you still, is the bartender part of your bio still right?
Yes. Yeah, I'm back working full time, unfortunately.
No. Okay, 1 more minute. Some people show up. It's a very orderly crowd. Everybody's quiet. Okay, I guess we can begin. Are you ready, Jason? I'll introduce you.
Yeah, I think I'm good.
Good. Hi, good evening and welcome to the 307th meeting of the New York Comics and Picture Story Symposium. This is a weekly lecture series about comics, illustration, animation, and the history of text image work. We're sponsored in part by the Will and Ann Eisner Family Foundation. I first came across Jason Lee's work while editing the Best American Comics for 2017. It was a story called Picaresque, and it was done under the name of Laura Palmal. And I just found out that it was the first narrative comic Jason ever made. It was done for the comics workbook competition, but it was seemed pretty sophisticated, I guess, in its humor and its pacing and its storytelling. So it immediately popped out. Anyway, Jason is working as a bartender and organizer, and he writes and draws and combines those pursuits in different ways. He works primarily through the medium of illustrated essays and zines, collected under the umbrella series title, Nothing Left to Learn. And as I said, his work was included in the Best American Comics for 2017 and 2018. His talk tonight is entitled Comics as Life, Not Comics as Life, the work of Jason Lee. So take it away.
Hello, everyone. My name's Jason. Thank you for coming out. So you may or may not have seen bits or pieces of my work around, but if you know who I am, it's probably through the zine series that Ben mentioned, which has kind of been like this continually evolving project that has been going on like as long as I've been drawing. It initially started as just like a place to put flyers so that I could sell them while on tour so that I could have money for beer and food and glue and things like that. And eventually I started to like experiment with different media and pseudonyms and formats in drawings about like a wide range of things, from like politics to Fast and Furious movies to like resource books full of fonts and patterns to literary comics that no one reads, to like more memoirish writing. But in the past couple of years, I haven't really done much grading at all. So I was a little hesitant to give a presentation, but Ben Ketcher said a discussion or presentation about why I haven't really been would be a relevant use of time for this space. So I've decided to honor that. So the topic of like why a creatively inclined person might not be doing that much work in this day and age is obviously can be very loaded, especially for me. It's wrapped up in a lot of things like mental and behavioral issues like social anxiety, depression, alcoholism, as well as like cultural, societal issues. A lot of it revolving around my experiences as like an Asian man in America in various settings. But I guess to put it in a more general sense, it's a lot of it's just like, I think my and a lot of people's inability to find or convey ourselves in like socially constructed spaces, both in person and online. So it's kind of like, I think at times may venture into like rambling or ranting, but I hope that on some level it's something people can find interesting and can relate to on some level. But I'll preface this by saying these are just like my experiences, and I haven't really engaged with comics all that much over the last 2 years. So they're pretty limited. There might be some things that people disagree with, especially people who have like more kind of like firsthand knowledge of comics over the last few years. But I guess for me, the question is not whether like my opinions are valid or whether you and I agree on what problems exist, as much as like hoping for, I guess, future comic spaces where people have like a willingness to share and build new spaces together in a way that kind of acknowledges like divergent experiences that can often be like seemingly contradictory or hard to understand. Yeah, and then I guess before I get started with the slideshow, just a content warning. One of my preoccupations has always been connections of between like masculinity, white supremacy, poverty, and violence. So there's kinds of a lot of skulls and dicks and guns and other vulgar things. Just thought I'd put that warning out there. And as far as the slideshow itself goes, it's kind of more chronological or more strictly chronological than what I'm talking about. So it doesn't always match up. And it looks like I can access the chat. So if you want me to go back to anything or have questions, you can drop them there and I'll try to answer them so that it's not just me talking uninterrupted for like however long this is gonna last. But yeah, so just gonna start with how I got started drawing, because I think to talk about why I don't do it that much anymore, some context is important. I went to film school and kind of fancy myself more of a writer than an artist, though I don't really have much writing to show for it. I took one drawing class in college because I was curious about eventually getting into animation, but a couple animators I knew were very discouraging and told me that I wouldn't be able to do it, so I kind of just stopped. And I think that's kind of like, there's a theme for me of my drawing really being tied to wanting to feel like a part of a group or social support network or like a, I don't know, community of some kind, even though that word's kind of thrown around a little too liberally sometimes. But so I started drawing in 2012. I was around 25. If you followed my work in the past, you've probably heard me talk about some of this kind of stuff. So I apologize if it's a little redundant, but I'm operating under the assumption a lot of people don't know who I am. But yeah, to get started with like the images here. So I was 25. I'd been living in Austin for a couple of years. I'd been wanting to get involved in punk. But in a lot of ways, what attracted me to punk was that it represented a lot of things that I felt that Asian people were not supposed to be, especially angry and cool. So I didn't think anyone would want to be in a band with me. And at that time, there was far fewer Asian people involved in punk, to the point that when I was in a band, people would often mistake me for being the singer of a more popular band, even though that person and I looked nothing alike. So I didn't believe that being involved in that like forward-facing capacity was something that was available to me. So I kind of settled on adding to the culture of our scene aesthetically. So I just drew flyers and eventually shirt and album art for bands. So this is the first flyer I ever made. It was for a show I booked at a recycling warehouse. A lot of trash was thrown all around, and got a lot of rashes from being covered in like rotting food. But anyway, and for a while, like, oh yeah, and then so it's like, it kind of just like, the drawings are like terrible, but I think it was like being a part of like this group of people, and it was like this social thing where like I could put something out and people would respond to it immediately. And it's kind of like that recurring theme of like my creative output being really tied to like my social confidence and like my desire for like peer support. And for a while, that's like something that I really found. I found a bit of a home like booking punk shows. I had a record label. I fronted a band that was at least popular enough to get invited to festivals and put out a record in Europe. And during this time, I gained some notoriety as a punk artist, even though clearly I couldn't draw very well. And well, I never had like a huge following. I was doing shirts for bands at least like 2 or 3 times a month, from like everywhere from friends in Texas to like skinheads in Russia who somehow found out about me. And I was being asked to contribute to a lot of things. I had at least enough of a standing that I was able to compile what I'm pretty positive was like the largest survey of contemporary international punk art that's ever been put on. And for all the like kind of later misgivings I had about like the failures of alternative communities to practice ideals, at least this one was a lot of fun. And I don't know, there was just times when I would kind of be at a show and then people would be jumping everywhere, and it's just like you're in this room and just living, and it was kind of like these glimpses into the world as like it could or should be. But by 2015, those moments were kind of becoming harder and harder to come by. I was living in a venue. I got involved in booking a punk festival with some pretty terrible people, it turns out. It was a really bad experience. And talking to people about it later, I kind of realized I had no idea like the extent to which the people I'd been involved with were kind of problematic. And it felt like, I don't know, I was like very depressed. I had no money. I was living in Los Angeles, so it like felt like the twist at the end of like noir movies where you realize like just how far or how deep the rot goes. But it was kind of this very unmooring experience where I made a lot of enemies with people who kind of really wanted to protect their place in the scene as it existed. And so they're defending these people who had guns who had paid to like have guns pulled on people, who had like sexually assaulted people, who had stiffed workers out of like contract work money. And it was, I don't know, I found it to be like really sad to like see a lot of people that I knew involved in that. I kind of just fell out of touch in a lot of ways. Oh, and this image my partner thought I should add because it was like an example of like how even when just doing like t-shirts for punk bands, I was like a little bit working with like story structures and stuff. And I see there was a question in the chat saying what tools used to draw then reproduce. It was all pen and ink. And then oftentimes like collaged together in Photoshop. So instead of like doing penciling so that I could just draw a full image, I was kind of like too impatient to do that. So I'd just draw all the images separately and then try to put them together with whatever limited Photoshop knowledge I had. But yeah, so like at this time I was like kind of, I don't know, I found it like really hard to continue engaging in like this scene that I'd been a part of. So there's like this drastic change to my social involvement in punk, which was kind of like, to me, the entire like world in which I was like putting my drawings. So it kind of really changed my relationship to drawing. And yeah, as part of this, I kind of like decided to stop drawing for bands, stop taking money for artwork for at least a period of time, because I kind of felt that like doing so much artwork for other people, and the fact that like so much of the artwork in our scene was being done by this really small number of people was just kind of a detriment to the visual culture of punk in general. But at this point, I was also just like very heartbroken, and staying involved in the same way felt like it would be like living in the same room with someone you'd just broken up with or something. So I kind of mostly decided to like venture out of that a little bit. But right around this time, people kind of coincidentally started encouraging me to make comics. I was like kind of asked to contribute a couple things to like punk comic zines, but I didn't know anything about comics. Like I think in college I'd read Art School Confidential after I saw the movie. And then I read The Watchmen because it was on Time Magazine's list of 100 greatest English novels. And then my roommate saw me reading a comic, so he gave me blankets. But that was kind of like my entire history with comics up to that point. And so, yeah, I mean, I literally Googled what are the best comics of 2015 or something. And then that's kind of how I found out about like Michael DeForge and whatever people are doing, or like the kind of people that like comprise like the comics world now, as it were. And let's see. Yeah, this is the flyer for that art show that I put together. This was, I made like a resource zine of fonts for punk kids to use. So it was just like 25 different fonts that were like intended to be used in like flyers and band art. I don't like Morrissey. I made like a fan art or protest art about, yeah, just not wanting him around anymore, I guess. And then did a zine of woodcuts of poems that I wrote while on lunch break at a museum where I was working in the coffee shop. And then this was kind of like one of my first ever comics. It was, I don't know, because again, I had like no reference points with comics. So most of my like first few months of comics were just comics that were still kind of about punk. And I think the first, oh wait, so let me go back a little bit. And I was like very active on Tumblr as I was like making this transition. And this was kind of in like the heyday of the comics workbook. There was this contest. All this money was being raised to buy a house to function as a school. And I think kind of in my like desperate need to like find another thing to be idealistic about, all those ideals and all that optimism I'd had wrapped up in punk, instead of just kind of like crashing and burning because of like my bad experience, were given this like parachute, and I was like able to make what seemed like a lateral move into comics. And this was I was pretty convinced at one point I was going to write like a encyclopedia length graphic review of Nicolas Cage's life and career, and that's what this is from. And this as well. But yeah, so as Ben mentioned before, this was I made a comic for the comics workbook competition, and yeah, it was like my first kind of narrative comic that I'd ever really made. I think I'd been making comics for maybe 3 months or 4 months at that point. It was like, but they were mostly like short strips that didn't really make a lot of sense. But I don't know, I like finished this thing. Oh man, I guess this is out of order. Okay, so this is like a I guess, spread from it. But I don't know, it was like, it's just kind of like exhilarating to do something new. And it was like, I don't know, as like a young artist, like you do something, and even if the product is not that great, like it's like the feeling of doing this thing is like so exhilarating, that like I was just like convinced it was amazing and that I'd win a contest, and then like everything would be great for me. And I didn't like place or get a mention or anything, but it was still really exciting, especially because this was a comic that I'd started as a prose story some years before and had just like never been able to finish. And then I was kind of like forced into just making something for a deadline, and this just like by virtue of like it being in pictures and like there being this time crunch was something that just kind of fell into being and came together, which is something that I found to be really exciting. Yeah, this is super out of order, but this was, I made a zine that was like entirely made up of like hand-drawn and photocopied like stippling and textures and grays to like, I don't know, be used for collages or whatever. This was the cover of a zine I made about the Fast and Furious movies. And this is the cover of my second comic that or I guess third comic that I did. And it was kind of like soon the same way that when I was like really involved in punk, my whole life revolved around like getting to festivals where I could kind of share work and party with my friends. My entire life started to revolve around like trying to get into and get to and exhibit at comics and zine fests. So like my year in life was like very much structured around making it to these festivals, like all my time off requests, really even a lot of the like production of comics, because since I mostly finished zines in order to have something to show at these events, like they were kind of what drove a lot of the creative output. But yeah, I don't know. Eventually it kind of started to feel like I was becoming like a machine whose like function was to go to and attempt to financially survive traveling to and paying for tables at festivals and expos, which is pretty hard to do when you sell things for $5 and no one knows who you are. But I was somehow selected for Best American Comics in 2017. And I don't know, it was pretty exciting. It was like a thing that would kind of like gave me some encouragement to keep going for a little bit. But it's kind of like not all that much changed really. Like I got into like maybe one more festival the next year. Still like no one was like really kind of like, it didn't like feel at least like anyone had like noticed or any more people were like noticing my work. So it's kind of like this weird thing where I'd like set myself up for failure by having too many expectations, as I often do. I got into Best American Comics again the next year with like some pretty goofy stuff that I'm not super proud of, but I'll take it. And it was just like, I think at this time I was also like feeling a little creatively stagnant. So I started to use zines to just kind of really do whatever I felt like doing. So I would like draw these like illustrations based off like major boxing matches that were happening. I would do like all kinds of writing about boxing or food or whatever I happened to be like obsessed with at the time. I still was drawing a little, or I started drawing for bands a little bit again, mostly like friends of mine. But yeah, it was kind of like this, I think is like kind of trying to recapture like a sense of community a little bit, because like I found comics spaces to be like largely kind of alienating, where you like show up in this place, you don't know anyone, I'm like just sitting behind this table for a long time. And it's just like this stressful experience of like wondering if like how much money I was gonna lose a lot of the times. And I was like, when I was a punk artist, I'd be traveling a lot. I'd routinely print like 200 or 300 copies of a zine, but like that was just kind of like a steady decline to the point where I think my last zine I probably only printed like 50 copies of. So I don't know, it's just kind of like both like exciting to work in and like really discouraging, I think, socially in a lot of ways. And so it's like, here I am. Oh, this was like a scene I made about, it's like an illustrated essay about like the politics of the service industry and tipping. And so it's kind of like just working full time, pulling all-nighters every few months, just like in order to have something for these events. And like, you know, just like considering success, like selling enough zines to make it to the table, make the table feedback, and just chalking the rest up to like the cost of going on vacation to Bethesda or Cleveland or whatever, which is also something that was like really only allowed at all by the fact that I'm like educated, come from relative financial privilege, and was able to like work my way into really stable work as like a high level bartender. But I don't know, there was like, I think increasingly I became like sad about like what seemed like comics and zine spaces that had these like significant barriers to entry, like money and time and notoriety. But it was also that these spaces were like inscribed with practices and language and like kind of signs and markers that I didn't really quite understand, and like where it felt like people didn't understand mine. So like in this world where like art appreciation takes on this social character, like it kind of felt like if you're a person or group of people who don't have reference points that are like understood by like a wider culture, like you're also kind of lacking in the privilege of like being heard or understood. And that was kind of something I found myself increasingly up against and saddened by. So it was like my first time at SPX, I was like exciting because I was like at the big show, and someone came to my table, flipped through my zines, and just said, "Oh, like men shouldn't be allowed to make anything," to their friend, and they like had a laugh and then moved on. And then next week, someone said something really similar, and it was like every time I recount these stories to people, they're pretty like incredulous, and I think talking to people about it has like let me know it's like not something other people really encounter. And it's like, I think to me, it's like looking around at festivals, there's plenty of other men, plenty of straight white men, and it was like only I was having this experience, and it felt like very much like my general experience as an Asian man, where like kind of in the wider culture were like feminized and seen as like weak and subject to inequalities that in a lot of ways share like or have like gendered parallels, and yet like you would be in this other space and then it was kind of like at the same time having this very contradictory response coming the other way, where like I kind of felt like I was being I don't know, like treated as like a stand-in for patriarchy or toxic masculinity at large, because I was like the safest person, I think, for people to kind of take that out on. But I don't know, that's like something I've been able to communicate privately sometimes, but it's like something that's like, it says, Austin says, can you repeat what they said? I didn't hear. It was just someone came up to my table. I was flipping through one of my comics and just said men shouldn't be allowed to make anything to their friend. And then they kind of laughed and then put my comic down and then moved on. And then almost the same exact thing happened the next week at another zine fest. But kind of to get back to, where was I? Oh yeah, so it's like something that's like really hard to communicate in public because I think without the kind of like cultural reference points that many groups of marginalized people have through like kind of like histories of like I think accurate and meaningful representations, I think a lot of people's general response sometimes is that it's just kind of like a straight man talking about his problems, and you're like, you become like self-conscious that you're coming off as like a men's rights activist or something. And there's all this like data and evidence that Asian men are considered like the least desirable people in America. There's all these stigmas about us being perverts and especially abusive partners, to the point that like it's like something I hear when like I go to dinner in like Koreatown. I can overhear people talking about how they don't have any money, but at least they can sell their panties to Asian men. Or how a few years ago in Brooklyn, there was a murder spree where a white man killed random Chinese men with a hammer in order to like save Chinese women from perceived, I guess, abuse, which I'm not saying doesn't happen. It's just that like, instead of having like, oftentimes it feels like instead of being able to have conversations about the way things or aspects of things as varied as like beauty or morality or gender and violence are constructed in certain ways against stereotypes of all different kinds of people, and like the ways like we could learn from how our notions of these things have been constructed against various different types of people in various ways, and kind of get this like fuller understanding of like the ways like colonialism and imperialism and have kind of like shaped the way that we view people and genders and all these other kinds of things. I think my experience was often that like people would bring this up, or I would see like on Twitter or something, someone would bring this up and then immediately get shut down and kind of told that we're just kind of complaining about not being able to get laid and get grouped together with incels. So like it just often feels like there's this very real social barrier where this experience of my life and kind of like my attempts to like understand my experiences or something I can like often never really quite get to the root of, because that space between me and that understanding is so fraught with all this like for a lot of people very traumatic and fraught territory. But yeah, to backtrack a little bit, March 2020, obviously the COVID pandemic started. At that point, I hadn't finished a zine in about, I don't know, probably a year. And I kind of just like assumed I would eventually just hop back into it as soon as I got settled in Los Angeles again. And then I got to stop working for a year because of the pandemic. So I think as like a lot of people, I assume this would be this time of like unmatched creativity. But this is like very much not the case for me. So when the social uprisings began in the summer, I found myself making a lot of art to kind of contribute to that culture of protest, and it felt really great. It was like something that I thought I was pretty good at, and I was able to raise a lot of money for things I care about, like rent strikes and food access in marginalized communities and mutual aid work. And it just felt like that same thing of like, this was something everyone was participating in, and I was like adding to something. And that was really something I hadn't felt in a long time. But also that came with like, I think kind of overnight, the way we were like expected to engage online changed really dramatically. And I think it kind of, to me, really spoke to the power of like social platforms to kind of create and reproduce consensus and order, ideas of propriety or justice or morality, and like even like boil those things down to like language and tone, and cadence, and like kind of create these like signs and markers that could stand for like those ideas. And like it felt a lot like just watching people I knew kind of like often call each other out, that like these rules that were being created in kind of real time were like not really very conducive to true social change. There were a lot of times there were like things we were largely comfortable with and agreed upon already. And I don't know, like people talk about doom scrolling a lot as like consuming this constant barrage of negative news, but I think like to me an often overlooked part of that is just like the way you see the entire structure organizing and reasserting itself only through like newly created like words and symbols and things. So we talk about like politicians and corporations co-opting language, but kind of not really, or without really like assessing the ways that we might be playing a role in creating that pathway by oftentimes letting these concepts like reimagining things to become reduced to words, which then become like symbols that are very easy to co-opt and proliferate in anything like other than practice. And yeah, just like kind of watching people like often like really tear each other apart. It's like this like idea that we're like talking about making this new world, but the way we were kind of fighting over it was still very much rooted in things like shame and perfectionism, where you're kind of like expected to have like polished responses already, and then like the responses to them, or negative responses, being like still very rooted in like normative ideas of like dominance and success. So it's like oftentimes we'd like not get the best or most revealing take or something, but the least offensive one for our particular space. And then we would kind of like watch this first acceptable thing kind of become consensus without like really being like, not as a new thing, but like something that we were like comfortable with already on some level. And it just kind of felt like in a lot of ways engaging online during this time was yeah, just in a lot of ways like recreating the same world every day, and like moving on to this the next day's topic where we would kind of like reinforce it again. And it kind of became like very I think draining and hard to continue engaging online. So again, that was just like this other instance where like this thing that had kind of become just like this medium for sharing drawings kind of became something else, and for good in a lot of ways. But I think it was just for me, as someone who like primarily was sharing things through the internet, it kind of made it like difficult to like find where I would kind of like continue to put things if I did make them. And it would just be like, by the time, like, even though it like felt good to make these drawings and things, things would just like progress so quickly that by the time I got another idea or thought I could finish something, it almost felt like the world had moved on to the next thing. It was like really jarring. Like, it was really hard to get to the table to draw anything anymore. So I kind of mostly chose to prioritize mutual aid work. I was going to protest 2 or 3 days a week just to help supply water and snacks and sunscreen and stuff to protesters. From there, I became involved in doing distributions in Skid Row, and became involved in my local tenants union. And this is where I kind of started practicing principles of mutual aid. So we're these people who get together toward this purpose of helping redistribute some of our resources in Skid Row, or standing with vulnerable tenants as they faced evictions. But you're also just like spending so much time with these people that you don't really share that much in common with outside of this organizing work you're doing. That you're like forming these groups that are political in nature, like explicitly anti-capitalist and anti-racist and anti-patriarchal. But we're also like, I think the difference with these kinds of spaces from like other alternative spaces I'd been a part of was there were a lot of like very conscious decisions made to practice being around people, and working with people and building relationships in ways that were rooted in very different ideals than the norms that largely dictate the ways we relate to each other. So it's like kind of, I don't know, it like sounds utopian, but it's not really. It's just like, I don't know, we just are able, or trying to like create spaces where people can have space to be themselves, bring their baggage with them, work through them, mess up, practice, and like just kind of like learn to undo a lot of the behaviors and like biases and things that we kind of learn through just living in this society. And like, instead of being like shamed or driven out for making a mistake, it's kind of like about building permanent spaces where people know where they stand and aren't made to like feel less than anyone else for not having it figured out already. So it's like a pretty, you've probably noticed in my like early punk flyers, there's a lot of like types of people crossed out, or like no this, no that. And so it's like a pretty stark contrast where, yeah, like those punk spaces are often like not less idealistic, but also rooted in exclusion in a lot of ways, in a kind of like misguided like attempt to form identity against something else, which is like also, I guess, a recurring theme of, or like a recurring preoccupation I have in my work and thinking. But yeah, so like so many times you'd like push out some kid who did something shitty, and then they'd inevitably fall into the arms of like Nazi skinheads who like basically accept anyone, and it like sends them down a path to being worse and not better. Or as I saw up close doing like eviction defense work, like a mentally ill woman who loses her children to the system can like end up being a big QAnon believer, because that's like a world that's like very easy to understand, and is in a lot of ways like very accepting, and like easy to engage with. And it's just like people want to feel like they're a part of something. They want to know where they stand, because it's just like mentally draining to have to worry about, or at least in my experience, it's like very mentally draining to have to, it's hard to like do work when you're also worried about like if you fit in, or you don't know how you're supposed to go about trying to be a part of something, because of, and I don't know, it's just kind of to relate it back to comics, it's like, to me, if we want things to be more just or equal within comic spaces, it's probably going to take having to create new spaces altogether. And I saw Austin English was here, but to give you the an example of like the level of cynicism I have, like kind of about the festival model and the way kind of people share comics right now. Austin gave a interview with the Comics Journal a few months ago, I think, and it had the title, "Everyone knows when they're trying to justify a moment they don't really stand behind." And he was talking about his process of like creating, but I immediately assumed it was like the state of like comics at large, in terms of like trying to go to festivals or like consign things in shops and things. So I really admire like the work he's doing to like, I don't know, just like really build this entirely new way of getting this different work out to people. But yeah, let's see if I have much else. Yeah, I guess like my last thing was just kind of that, I don't know, I think when talking about like, I think at the time I was like deciding not to really, or that I didn't want to go to festivals anymore. And because that was like such a big part of why, or what drove me to like finish work, was like to have something for festivals, so that when I kind of decided it wasn't worth it anymore, I didn't really kind of have the same impetus for like finishing work, although I started a bunch of things, just never finished them. And at that same time, there was like this push a little bit to kind of create like more just comic spaces, but they were kind of, and I think they were like, it was cool in a lot of ways, but it was a little over reliant to me on these like old school models of economic class. And obviously festivals are problematic in a lot of ways. Economic inequality within like the festival model is definitely a real thing, which I'm not sure can be really reformed or adjusted, given the extent that it relies on like event branding and curation and like both economic and social hierarchies. But so there's like people who talk about making comics unions. There's people who talk about bringing greater awareness to comics as an art form. And then to me, I think a third thing to kind of add to that would be like the idea that so many of our alternative cultures rely on the same ideas of success and merit, that like creates a lot of problems in our just general society. And they really contribute to burnout and overwork, and at least for me, like I guess like unrealistic expectations, or like perfectionism, or the idea that like if people aren't seeing or responding to my work, that's a problem that I have. So it's like contributes to that like burnout. But then there's like no real alternative. Like you can't just like you're never, there's like not a different world to return to. You would just kind of have to recharge and then go back into the same one, and it's like not something that I think is necessarily appealing to a lot of people. And it's kind of I don't know. So I think a lot of, for me, a big thing to add to like the discourse about how to make comics more sustainable for people would be how to make comic spaces places that people would like to continue engaging with. So like, can we grow comics not just by extending like a little bit of like economic viability, or like kind of prestige if like people see it or learn to appreciate it as art a little bit more. But like if we could use like the space to also practice like the kind of world we would like to live in, just in general, where we could have like different ideas of success, have new relationships and solidarities rather than like feeling like we're in competitions for resources for of like money or like recognition and things like that. But I don't know. It's not really something I have an answer for. It's just I think it's after the last year, it's like something I've been thinking about in terms of like asking different questions about maybe why, or some of the deeper questions about like why I personally, and many people like me, I'm sure, don't really feel like, or don't really feel enthusiastic about like continuing to take part in like this world of comics, not Earth. But I don't know. That's really all I have.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
That was great. So any questions or comments, you can just drop your name in the chat and I'll call on you in order. It's funny for somebody who remembers before alternative comic festivals existed, and the only comic festival was mainly about mainstream Marvel and DC, that world of comics. That this seemed like a whole alternative reality was created, and as you said, it's sort of replicating the structures of that other kind of comic festival. So it sounds like a lot of these are boiled down to the economics of making comics, because I mean, people want celebrities to sort of sell more books or make more of a living. And, there are all kinds of models for subsidizing the arts so that people can have very small or no audience almost and still make work, or a very small audience, like a village size audience, rather than a mass media audience. So anybody? Jason Lee, totally agree. Oh, Bob Sikoriak has a question.
Yeah, hi. Thank you so much for this, Jason. This is great. I think you're bringing up a lot of issues that I think are super important. I wish some of my students could hear you speak, because I think you're, grappling with a lot of things, and I really appreciate you coming here and talking about it with us. It seems like you've reinvented yourself a couple of times now with the kind of work that you make, and I was curious. I think you bring up these important issues. I was wondering if you see, I mean, maybe it's too early, maybe you'll figure this out, but I'm wondering if there's something you're excited about doing now just for yourself, or if you see a way to kind of reinvent yourself again, or any hopeful thoughts over this past terrible year.
Yeah, I don't know. I was like, I think at the beginning of the pandemic, I was like doing a lot more prose writing. For whatever reason, that's like kind of, I don't know, there's like so much discussion about whether like novels, I guess, are even relevant anymore. But I think that's the other thing. It's like, I think work is oftentimes such a thing that we like construct our identities and ideals with against a lot of times, that like I think for me, like there's this weird, and I've talked to a couple other people who feel this way about like writing prose specifically, that like you can't escape that like level of respect that you have for this like first art form that you fell in love with. So it's like, I don't know, I hope to be able to like finish writing. I think I don't know, now that I think about it, I didn't really like touch on it that much in the talk, but I think a lot of, I guess when I talk about like wanting or feeling like, not even that, like, that's the other thing, it's this like complicated conversation of like, do I feel like I need my work to be recognized, or I think for me, it's more that like feeling like there's a space in which it might be assessed at all is kind of like a thing for me, where it's kind of like I would make these comics. So like I would literally like work in a bar, get home at 1 o'clock, do comics till 6 in the morning. And then sometimes like, if I had to go to a festival, I would like get home from work, be printing and folding zines until like 8 in the morning, until I had to drive to DC or whatever to make the tabling time. So it's like, it just felt like when that kind of, or I don't know, just like feeling like it was kind of hard to see like a world in which people would even read this stuff was kind of as discouraging as anything else. But I don't know, I guess as far as like future work goes, I always think I might make more comics or have like more ideas for things, but it's just, I don't know. I think I have a hard time getting over, and maybe this is like a notion I put on myself, but it's one that I've like experienced in like trying to share work, but I don't know. I just don't like have a lot of confidence that people necessarily want the work that I want to make or something. So it's like kind of hard to get up for it in a lot of ways. But yeah, I don't know. Probably more prose writing, hopefully more drawings, once I figure out how to like use the internet in a healthy way.
I know Austin had August Alip had a question, a comment. Do you want to say that, or just let us read it?
Oh yeah, I don't know. Yeah, that kind of stuff seems, yeah, it just seems cool. There's like I think Austin said something about this before, but just like the model of like, or like the assumption that like sitting behind a table and selling work is like this universally kind of like understandable way of sharing work is, I think, brings a lot of weird dynamics into festivals and stuff. So I think, yeah, just alternative ways of meeting people and sharing work seems like something that's like interesting and worthwhile.
Yeah, that seems strange to me, having to sit next. The whole idea of making a printed object is you don't have to be there, and people don't have to connect the printed object with a person who they may have some weird bias against. So it's kind of something I would not look forward to doing. I mean, but you know, I guess the question is about, you know, for commercial publishing, it has to do with numbers. And for whatever they call it, sustainable publishing also has to do with some kind of number. And we know aggregators make a living. Aggregating a lot of failed projects, you can make money off of that. You know, like the Amazon model, or all these online models. But yeah, there still are countries where certain people get subsidies from the state to do what they do. Write an opera once a year, write a book. So that doesn't seem likely in this country. But
Yeah, I think, I don't know, I guess in a lot of ways, what I think for me, what I'm talking about is like in some ways less about making comics a world that we can, or like a medium that we can all live and make money off of, as much as like making, especially like alternative comics, which kind of often, and like, which often like a lot of DIY kind of media like presents itself as like a little bit more of like an idealistic thing, is like, yeah, I guess a lot of what I'm talking about is like making those spaces people want to like participate in and like feel healthy, rather than like being spaces where you're putting like economic and social pressures on yourself. Yeah.
Yeah. There is a small press festival in New York, not comics, but literary small press. And one year, it's almost maybe 15 or 20 years ago, they they canceled it. They just shut it down, and they said nobody wants to self-identify as a small press. We all want to be viable presses. Not We don't want that. We don't. The idea of being connected with a show like that was against everybody's idea of what they really wanted. So they shut down the small press fair for a few years. I think it started up again. Sorry. Any other questions? Okay. So, so do you think your bartending is a good source of inspiration for writing and drawing? Is
No.
that something? It's not.
No.
It is.
No, not at
No,
all.
it is. Oh, okay.
No, it's just, I don't know. It's like,
I always thought my jobs, non-art jobs, were really interesting to me, to see
I don't know.
what people really, what people do who don't sit around making pictures. What do they do?
Yeah, I mean, it is like fascinating in a lot of ways to like, I don't know, just like see people or like watch different performances or like social performances happen. I work at like a really fancy restaurant right across the street from Paramount Studios. So it's like often, I don't know, you get to see like people or kind of like the social codes of like business and power meetings or like dates or like all that kind of stuff is like sometimes fascinating, or like to think about the structures behind like how everything works. But I don't know, I don't think it's like that much more interesting than doing anything else really.
Do you have to mix the drinks yourself, or are you just serving drinks?
Oh yeah, I'm the bar manager, so I make all the drinks and come up with all the ideas and pick all the things.
Oh, okay. But you have a lot of time to talk to customers, or you're busy with
uh, I don't know, I prefer not to talk to people. It's like the least favorite part of my job, but I don't know, it depends on the night.
right? Yeah. I always fantasized. I was a shoe salesman, but I fantasized being a waiter, but I never did it. I think it's very exhausting work, but I love restaurant. You have to like to be in restaurants, I guess. Right? I sort of like to be in restaurants. Um, yeah. Last week, Anders Nielsen, he worked as a cook, an egg cook in some fancy restaurant. So So, well, yeah, so one part of, rethinking the normal art world is to say that, a bartender could also be one of the great cartoonists, but he's also a bar. He doesn't just have to be one or the other, or he could be, many other things too. So that's something I think is hard for people to accept in the art. But I mean, it's purely a matter of energy. If you have the energy to do both, most people don't. They're sort of exhausted doing other work. So, um, so anybody else? So what were you studying in school? Were you studying art? You said you read Art School Confidential. Were you in an art school?
I went to film school and
Oh, film school. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. That has its own parallels to the comics world, I guess, right? Alternative film. Now that,
Yeah, I wouldn't really know. I didn't really I think it was like something I realized I didn't really want to do, other than like the writing aspect of it and just appreciating it as a medium in general. I think probably somewhat, obviously it's probably informed all the other work I do a lot, especially comics.
right. Yeah. So, yeah, I know a lot of, I know, so you were on Medium years ago, a few years ago, was many years ago, on the website, on the that service, that kind of newsletter service. That form now called a newsletter rather than a blog, a subscription model seems to being having a revival, but I don't know what the numbers are. Somebody said, is Substance like that? Oh, Substack, yeah, sure. Similar, except I think you
Yeah,
subscribe to everything rather than individual writers. I think there's some difference.
yeah, I think that was like another it's like an interesting point, because I know, I don't know, like people, there was like people trying to, it's like harder and harder to kind of like monetize work in a lot of ways. So people are trying to find these new things, and they kind of oftentimes lead to like kind of even greater like individualism and like atomization of people, where, and I don't know, for me it seems like maybe a greater use of people's, especially like-minded like writers' time, would be to kind of try and start a alternative publication or press or magazine or something, than like everyone trying to individually vie for like individual contributions and stuff.
Right. Yeah, there's also, right, subscription sort of fatigue. Some people only have so much money to put toward hearing one person write that year. I mean, it's kind of strange, but rather than a magazine. But anyway, people are in a magazine, unless it's some kind of cooperatively run magazine, it becomes, there's a lot of hierarchies and taste being pushed on people, things you just couldn't show to a magazine. So I think that's sort of what's behind that at the moment. But I think it also has to do with the ad revenue that drove periodicals is kind of not connected to work anymore. It's just, it's connected to whatever they call it, surveillance data collection. So it's hard to monetize a magazine. Maybe it is easier to ask somebody to support an individual. But I mean, but anyway, the subscription model, you know, is a very old model for publishing, in that major these old legacy journals are kind of trying to, you know, put up paywalls to get subscribers. Seems very strange, because they don't. In the old, you know, in the old days, the price of the New York Times just barely covered the trucking or the newsstand man's cut. It didn't cover the writing, the editorial. It was all advertising. So yeah, I mean, if Facebook, of all social media, paid people to put work up every day, and it could add up to a living, that's another model. No one is. Yeah, I think we should be paid just for opening a website, like the newsstand man makes his living by cutting open a bundle of newspapers. I think we should be paid just for opening websites. So wait, there's a question from August.
Question is, how does your food writing relate to your artwork? Is that something that grew out of your food service work or a broader personal interest? I don't know. I think it's like a really weird. I get all these like misguided ideas where I'm like, oh, this will be the thing I can finally get like some like recognition, or like or like the avenue through like which I'll be able to like talk about things. So I think for food is like I don't know, I was like working in restaurants, like fancy restaurants. You're part of this world where they're kind of like treated like I don't know, reviewed or like treated like, I don't think restaurants are art, but I think like they get kind of oftentimes like reviewed in the same way or like judged. And I think it was interesting for me because it seemed like the realm in which I think Asian men in particular were able to kind of like attain a level of like prominence to like be able to like kind of talk about life experiences and stuff. And I don't know, sometimes it's unfortunate because once they get there, they're not always saying the best things. But I think it just seemed like also because food is like such a I don't know, visceral thing that like means so many things to a lot of people, that like even the idea of like restaurants being something that could be like talked about and reviewed in this way, like it was just like fascinating to me. And I don't know, I thought, yeah, it's just like such a space that like intersects with so many things, from like labor to like nostalgia or like racial identity and all of, and like politics, and like the way like people relate to each other. And yeah, I don't know, I think with food writing it just seemed like this opportunity to I think just be able to talk about some of the things that like preoccupy my mind in a way that like maybe it was more relatable because it was about something a lot of people engage with, which is like food and restaurants.
So what's a typical essay? What, can you give us an example of a food essay? It's just the subject.
Yeah, so I guess I'd like the they were like usually like at least like tangentially restaurant reviews, but I like kind of like use them to talk about other yeah, I guess like often political things. So kind of like there's like a big proliferation of like restaurants that will use like I guess foreign ingredients like kimchi or like Korean condiments and things like that. And it was kind of, I think for me, it was like the experience of seeing foods like this kind of largely cooked and talked about by like white men in Pittsburgh was like this very, I don't know, I think it just like through that there was like a lot to talk about like the way like we consume other people's cultures, or the ways that like people's, yeah, I guess just like the way that people's experiences and things become filtered through like kind of our like our broader culture of like patriarchy and like racial inequality. So it's kind of like this way of just like kind of talking about, or like using a restaurant to talk about this problem, or like using like some other restaurant to talk about like building the notion of like what California is like, or I don't know, all kinds of weird things. Not all of them were very successful, I'll add.
Right. Okay. Anybody else? Such a quiet audience. Hmm. Yeah. Well, anyway, I mean, but I can associate with that feeling that nobody wants to read the comics I'm making, because that's nobody. There was no place, before there was an alternative comics world. That was so. I think probably what's happening is things are just peeling off again into more and more different cultural areas. And so, yeah, when an alternative comics festival is held at a big corporate hotel, and it's all superstars of comics this time for another kind of venue to start, probably. That's what's happening. Okay, so thank you. That was really interesting to hear. Your work is really interesting, though. Talking about it is always another level of another problem. But so anyway, look up Jason's work if you can, because that's really fascinating. And thank you. So this is the last meeting of this semester, and we take the summer off and start up again at the end of August. We have a young cartoonist based in Singapore, pretty sort of painterly comics. So anyway, that'll all come up soon. So thank you, everyone, and see you at the end of August, if we're all around still. Take care. Thank you, Jason. Thank you.
Yep.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for having me. Thanks for coming out, everyone. Take care.
Bye-bye. Good night.